In the last lesson, we learned all about case writing. In this section, we're going to shift gears a little, and we're going to start focusing on rebuttals. So, what are rebuttals? So, rebuttals are on-the-fly speeches where you respond to your opponent's case and arguments, and you craft what you're going to say in the rebuttal speeches during the prep time. So during your prep time, after the opponent gives maybe his affirmative case, during your prep time, you use your prep time to figure out what you're going to say to respond to that case in the rebuttals. And then you give the rebuttal speech. So it's important to note that unlike the cases which are pre-written, the rebuttals are not pre-written because you don't know in advance what you're going to say. Rather, you show up to the round, and based on what your opponent says in the round, you come up with arguments for the rebuttals. And obviously, you don't know what your opponent's going to say beforehand, so you usually can't prepare this beforehand. So this is all on the fly. During your prep time, you figure out the arguments. Now, we're going to talk at the end of this section how you can sort of anticipate what kind of arguments the opponent might run, and then you can kind of pre-write some things and put them in a document. We'll get to that later. But for the most part, rebuttals are usually thought of as on the fly. You're both responding to your opponent's case and arguments, and you're also defending your own case and arguments, because your opponent is going to use his rebuttals, his or her rebuttals, to attack you and attack your cases. And you need to use your rebuttals both to defend yourself and to attack your opponent. So the affirmative gets two rebuttal speeches. He gets the 1AR, which stands for the first affirmative rebuttal, and that's after the neg case. And he also gets the second affirmative rebuttal, which is after the negative rebuttal. And the second affirmative rebuttal is the last speech of the round, which is kind of nice. The AF gets the last word. The negative rebuttal, the first rebuttal is at the end of his neg case. So it's all one 7-minute long speech, but usually the first 4 minutes are the case, and the last 3 minutes you use as a rebuttal. And there's flexibility there. It's not a hard and fast rule. You can use whatever time combination you like. You can even do 5 minutes for the case and 2 minutes for the rebuttals, as long as it adds up to 7. And again, the neg case is after the affirmative case. And then the neg also gets a NR speech, a negative rebuttal speech, after the 1AR and in between the 2AR. So it's AF case, neg case with neg rebuttal, first affirmative rebuttal, negative rebuttal, second affirmative rebuttal, end the round. So those rebuttal speeches are where you're going to be using these skills. Now, before we get into how to come up with the arguments for the rebuttals, I do want to go over a few general things that you need to know. And the first thing is that during these rebuttals, and really during the whole round, always be gracious and professional. You always want to be respectful to your opponent. It's okay to be a little aggressive, but you never want to be rude or demeaning. Remember, this is a serious debate, and you really want to. It really helps your credibility too if you come off as a more of a nice person and not too demeaning towards your opponent. One way to think of it is pretend you're on a world stage debating these important issues. Pretend you're on national television. If you were on national television debating these things, you wouldn't want to, be mean to your opponent or anything like that, because that would make you look bad. You want to act very professional at all times. And remember the reason you're debating. It's not just to win, but it's also to glorify God. So you want to glorify God with the way you debate. All right, another thing which is specific to LD debate is when oftentimes you're going to have to reference your opponent. Like if I'm the affirmative and the negative said something, I'll have to say, well, the negative, brought up this argument, and my response is, when you're referring to your opponent that way, always call him either my opponent or the negative if you're affirmative, or if you're negative, you would call your opponent the affirmative. Don't actually reference the person's name. So, for example, if I'm debating Bob, I don't want to say, well, in his last speech, Bob said. I don't want to do that. I don't want to reference the name. I want to leave it impersonal. I just want to say, my opponent said, or the negative said, so you can see over here. So you don't actually reference your opponent by name. And why? Because leaving the name out keeps it impersonal. Remember, when we're debating in LD, it's not a personal thing. We don't want to be having a personal argument with our opponent. We still want to be friends at the end of the round, right? It's not that we're having a disagreement with them. It's just we're having a disagreement with their side, because it's a debate. But at the end, we should still be friends. Me and Bob should still be friends. We're not mad at each other or anything. We're just having a debate because, that's what we're supposed to do. If I start calling him Bob and said Bob's argument was stupid, that starts to make it personal. Bob might start getting offended, and things might start getting ugly after that. But if I say my opponent's argument is flawed, just generally saying my opponent reminds Bob, oh yeah, this is just a debate. He's just doing this because I'm his opponent. That's what he's supposed to do. But it's not personal, directed against me. So you want to leave the names out. If you accidentally forget, though, and use the name, that's fine. You are going to run into some opponents who don't follow this rule, and they're going to call you by name, and just try not to take it personally, and just don't you know that they're not referencing, know that they don't have anything against you. They're just debating because that's what they're supposed to do. And if they do call you by name, that's fine. Just let it go. There is no rule or anything about that. It's just something that, in general, people agree with as debate etiquette. Anyway, going back to the rebuttals and your strategy. Your responses in the rebuttals to your opponent's arguments provide the judge with a reason to disagree with your opponent with each part of your opponent's value and criterion and contention. So what you often do is, we call this going down the flow. So we talked about in the last lesson flowing, and you want to kind of go down the flow and hit each argument. You want to hit their value and say, Judge, this is what's wrong with their value. Judge, this is what's wrong with their criterion. Judge, this is what's wrong with their contentions. And that's why you shouldn't vote for them, you should vote for me. So that's called going down the flow, and you want to do that. You want to address each part of your opponent's case. You don't have to go in order. There's no rule about that, although going in order helps, I guess, for organization. So definitely feel free to do that if you want to. In some rebuttals, though, especially the first affirmative rebuttal, again, you don't want to use the whole time to just attack your opponent's arguments. You also want to debate your own case. You want to attack every point that's wrong with your opponent's case, but you also want to substitute that with each of your own points and continue to build up your case. So basically, don't just explain why your opponent is wrong. Explain why they're wrong and your case is correct. Don't just address their points, just forgetting about your whole case while you're addressing them. Address it with your case. Use your case to show why your opponent's case is wrong. Debate your own case. Remember, always have your case in mind and remind the judge in little ways about your case. Don't just drop the whole thing when you start attacking your opponent's case. And then finally, the last thing before we start moving into how to construct these rebuttal arguments, it's never enough to just say, my opponent's wrong. You can't just make a blanket statement like that. My opponent said this, however, my opponent is wrong. You can't say that because that doesn't say anything. You have to bring it all back to the resolution. We're going to look more at how to do that in the next few videos, how to effectively make arguments for the rebuttals and how to impact it to the resolution and impact it and show why these arguments matter. So in the next video, we're going to look at strategies for responding to your opponent's value.